We have been talking quite a bit about hate crimes and how they have surged during the Trump era, and also whether or not he's responsible, at least in part. Now, what we're going to do is give you some data and also some very disturbing trends. Counties that hosted Trump rallies in 2016 saw a 226% spike in hate crimes. The study done by the University of North Dallas professors says the Trump effect was most certainly a factor. Plus, there is a big jump in the number of hate groups operating in this country. This chart, it tells a story. You can see there was a big dip during the Obama administration, but it has been on an uptick ever since. The Southern Poverty Law Center, it's a group that tracks hate and will be joining us tomorrow, they did this study, and the trend, it is the same when you look at actual hate crimes. According to the Center for the Study of both Hate and Extremism at Cal State University in San Bernardino, hate crimes in major cities went up by double digits in 2017, and they've increased by 42% since 2010. My next guest, he is the Assistant Director of Research for that group, Kevin Grisham. He joins us now. Kevin, thanks for the time. And I listened to what the FBI Director, Mr. Wray, said, and this was before, obviously, the horrors of this past weekend. And he said in no uncertain terms, we're past theory here. It is compelling data that says white supremacy attacks, they make up the majority here of that uptick that I just described. Is it fair to say that there is a particular group here that's responsible for the bulk of this?
Well, we do know, just looking at overall, as you suggested, hate crime, of course, just even for this year, from January to May, we're seeing an increase from an increase of 9% last year up to about 26% so far this year. And the groups that have been targeted are traditionally the same ones that are being targeted this time around as well. And the perpetrators, particularly of violence like we saw in El Paso, are increasingly coming from white supremacist groups.
Do they find, why do you think, have we seen enough, of a tangible through line here, Kevin, where it's that they feel the environment, they feel that some of the rhetoric is fueling this, that they feel that they have more folks simpatico with how they feel of the invasion? I'm using some of the code words that we've heard here, that the climate is right here for this because they have friends and above. Why now?
Well, I mean, we've seen, of course, for many years an increase, but we definitely are starting to see, just looking at the chatter online by some of these groups, that they're starting to find a voice, at least that they believe is bringing their ideas more into the mainstream. And that's very dangerous because, prior to this time, those voices were often on the fringes and were often marginalized. And now, because of a variety of conditions, we're starting to see that they feel like they have no problem saying the things they want to say. And political rhetoric, of course, of any kind never helps whenever extremists think it's going to bring them into the mainstream.
Help me in terms of more than just changing this national dialogue, both the platforms and also the identification of these groups. For example, if this was some Islamic terror group, right away it would be domestic terrorism and would have more of a foci of all the different agencies on a national level that would be able to bear resources to it. And also we see sites like this 8chan and the rest. How much of a problem do you attribute to where these kind of toxic rhetoric and language can find a foothold without any checks and balances? And then also that the way that it's labeled in the groups, white nationalists are treated differently than if it was another hate crime group.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we definitely need to treat it as it is. It's extreme violence that leads to murder, and it doesn't matter who the perpetrators are, but we often do see that they're being treated very differently, particularly in recent years. For example, there was a very concentrated effort to deal with terrorism by the U.S. government post 9/11. Of course, our focus became more on sort of what often is referred to as Salafist jihadists. And then there was a more broadening of that. But in recent years, that's been hollowed out. And actually, many of the people who worked in the U.S. government on these issues are no longer working there because those offices have been shrunk in staff. So if you don't have resources to go after these groups and track them online, then we can't expect to be able to counter them. And that's very dangerous in itself.
I didn't want to be right, but on Friday's program, before this weekend's events, I did a whole thing on just how concerned I was by, you could almost feel like the water coming to a boil, and some of the irresponsible rhetoric almost fomenting that soon somebody was going to get really hurt. Now, I never thought there'd be 2 shootings and more than 30 Americans dead as a consequence, but this can't be described as unforeseen. We saw, you can tangibly feel it with just the anger that was out there and the encouragement for the worst elements. How worried are you that it wasn't just a tragic weekend, but if unchecked, and if this rhetoric continues, we're going to see a lot more of the Daytons and a lot more of the El Pasos?
Well, definitely, it's very concerning, to be very honest with you. This kind of rhetoric, those who've worked in this even longer than I have, like my colleague Brian Levin said to me even just a year ago, that whenever you see increases in this kind of vitriology, this increases in hate crime, somebody's done it as long as Brian said the exact same thing to me even a year ago. And somebody like myself who studied for the last 20 years, including international groups, we're seeing basically, I think the conditions are incredibly ripe for, sadly enough, more of these tragedies to occur. So if there's going to be action, it needs to be now. This is the time.
Because in some ways, I mean, look at the Texas shooting. I mean, he drove 600 miles to go to El Paso, clear across the state of Texas. This wasn't a random shooting. This was done because he believed he was part of a cause. And to me, that's the most frightening part. You combine, insanity, frankly, weaponize it, and then give it some form of a mantra. You just don't turn that off with a speech. You've lit the fuse.
No, absolutely. And political leaders, regardless of which political party come from, need to be very aware of what they're saying can, in some cases, take a foothold with people who, whether they have mental illness or they're perfectly fine, the reality is that they see them as potentially a call to arms in some of these people's cases. And of course, in reading the manifestos left by the El Paso shooter, I think that's pretty obvious when you look at the terminology that's being used, the rhetoric's being used as stuff that we've been hearing for about the last 2 to 3 years over and over again. To think that those two things are connected, I think, is just really just keeping our eyes shut to the big problems right in front of us.
I'm like you, Kevin. I'm very worried here, but I appreciate your time here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
All right, when we come back, we will shift gears, and obviously there's a political lens to this, and it has to do with politics, guns, 2020. The democratically controlled House, they've already passed a bill to expand background checks, but the GOP-led Senate won't even let it get to the floor to have a vote. That's because Mitch McConnell says no. We're going to take a look at how all this could play out and how it could play out on the campaign trail as well.